Discovered some interesting wallpaper. That beam was there because a room had, well, it's a long story, I don't think I have time. The fireplace was rebuilt in the 60s, and the nitwit that did it put it skiwampus instead of leaving it square. So that left the main beam going from the front and back of the house with no support. So, and then I guess in the meantime, they tore out a room. You can see right here, and there's also markings in the floor where there had been a thin walled room. So I replaced that and got rid of that beam. This is what it looks like a little bit more after the lath. The plaster was pretty well shot. It had actually been covered. I took it down and it was kind of this and that. The problem was with the lath, the little animals had lived up there for many years, as shown by the thousands of corn cobs that were up in there. And of course they had their little corners for their potty, and so that meant that there were sections of this lath that was saturated. And I didn't want to sit in there watching American pickers smell, what's that smell? You know, so I took it down and replaced the ceiling.
Did they use horsehair?
Yes, absolutely. This is how we dated the place. We found this. Now that's what they did. It's there and I look at it every day. It drives me nuts. I understand, I don't believe this from what I've looked at, but a piece of the paneling, supposedly it was around this, it might have been brought from upstairs. I couldn't see where upstairs it might have been. But I took it down, the paneling down, because they put some of it in upside down. So that's got to be redone. And this is one of those fun things about construction. See here where they cut literally all the way through the beams to put plumbing in? Any inspection people here? It's all been replaced. And then, of course, this was all over the place. There were many things that were numbered. The windows were numbered. The sills on the outside was pretty cool. Now, horsehair plaster has a tendency to move over the years. Windows leak. You can see right here, obviously, there was a leak and it came down. There were places where it was gone. There were places where it was just kind of hanging there, literally by the horsehair, because it had come loose from the lath. Well, good old Google, I looked on there and I found out what they do if you're serious about restoring a place. You gently push the stuff back in, you drill a hole, vacuum it out, get your caulking gun with glue, squirt it in there, and then you take a metal disc, sheet wall screw, and put it in, and it just pushes that right up against the lath. Leave it for a couple of days, good as new. And I would defy anybody to go in there and find which was original and which was re-glued. This is the kitchen floor. The kitchen was basically redone because the walls and everything had been rotted. The place over here under the sink, the end of the beam had rotted off, and a couple of spots up there by the back door where the moisture got in. Other than that, it's solid as a rock. I mean, it's really amazing how tight and secure and strong everything was. Want to back up a second?
Sure.
I built these boxes around here, put insulate again to keep the critters out, because there's no crawl space here. It's you can let a cat in there maybe. Okay, and I put in the rock salt insulation, hex tubing, my homemade reflectors, and so I've got radiant base heat, floor heat. Boy, you want me to finish? I still got 3 minutes. And they wanted me to show that. They're the controls. Okay, next.
Razzle dazzle modern stuff.
These are 2 windows with insulation. Okay. Little setback and the wall caved into the basement when we were trying to do the thing there. Had that 24-foot span. The 2 corners were there. That beam never moved. And I guarantee you now, when that house falls down, that wall's going to be standing. It's in the base now. Okay. This is the front stairwell. I spent the whole day in there today and yesterday, for that matter.
Was it solid?
Pardon?
Is that solid?
Solid, what do you mean?
The banister.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, you couldn't
Sturdy.
wiggle it loose, it wasn't
Oh,
sturdy?
no, it's great.
Yeah.
It's a little hollow because it goes in there. This had horsehair plaster on it. The wonderful people that lived in there rented it recently, most recently, tore it down and exposed the paneling. They thought the paneling was better with the millions of nail holes in it. I put the sheetrock back up because.
That's,
And here's the ballroom again with some of the paint gone. And that's my treatment of the ceiling. I tried stripping the ceiling, I tried paint remover, I tried a heat gun, I tried scraping, and the only thing that would work was finally was a ceiling, 2 ceiling coats, and then just a dressing coat of compound. And this out here, this is all lime plaster. Tried to do it, can't do everything, but that's it.
Can I ask a question?
I've got a minute to spare. Yeah.
Sir, was it your intention to restore the property to, for example, upstairs, a lot of these inns had a place where people could dance, and so was your intention to restore it in that direction, or was it for you to bring it up, your intention to bring it up to modern use?
I'm not having dances in there. It's got electrical, it's got plumbing, it's got heating. I mean, the room is there for whatever it wants to be used for.
so I think that what Ron has been doing, as I mentioned, is really what's more called the rehabilitation. He's done a great job preserving the key remaining historic characteristics of it, but he's rehabilitating it for contemporary use. And from my perspective, that's a totally valid way to go about this. This isn't a museum, and the best way to preserve a place like this is often to make sure that it remains usable for contemporary life. And
The upstairs, except for the 2 bathrooms that we put in, where the back stairs used to come up, it's 100% the way it was. I mean, new paint and stuff like that, but nothing else has changed. Well, there is a closet that we did that was around the fireplace. I'll hang around after if anybody's had other questions.
just before we leave Kenniston's Tavern, I'd like to read you a little bit from an article that appeared in the 1861 Portsmouth Herald. It's really a lovely little description of somebody reminiscing about what Kenniston's Tavern was like under Henry Kenniston. It goes, that gentlemanly landlord passed away some 30 years ago, and since then the signboard has been taken down, and his children there enjoy the quiet of domestic life. Goes on to recall that Kenniston had a motto posted by the door that said, walk in, gentlemen, sit down and take your ease, pay for what you call for, and call for what you please. After Kenniston's death, there was an estate inventory that's in the probate records, and it lists a variety of bar equipment, beds, linens, and kitchenware that exceeds in number the normal inventory for a single household. Also, there were a list of debts owed to the estate by local residents that indicates both that this was a popular place for Strathamites, but also that Kenniston was probably not entirely strict about applying the rule of pay for what you call for. So, one other interesting mention of this I found was from a 1933 Exeter newsletter that announced the opening of Ye Old Stratham Hill Tavern at this site, the Kenniston Tavern, and it was decorated on the exterior with orange and green awnings. And in that room, I think probably the room with the fireplace, before the fireplace had been moved, as Ron pointed out, there was seating for about 40 diners at sawbuck tables and benches. Alas, there are no photos of this. If any of you in your attics are harboring photos, I would love to see some. But orange and green awnings made me wonder, like, Is this a precursor of Howard Johnson? Okay. Now we're going to move reluctantly away from Kenniston's Tavern. And I mentioned before that taverns were places where business and legal matters were conducted. And one of the ways we find out about these things are ads. And this is an ad for a meeting of the Beau proprietors at Mrs. Chase's. And Marcia will be talking about this more. One of the advantages of Chase's Tavern was it was located near the meeting house. This is the meeting house or congregational church. It was built in 1768. And this drawing, as the caption says, drawn from recollections of aged citizens. And I mentioned how much taverns really just look like anybody else's house. And you can see that meeting houses also, except for the addition of the steeple, look like my house actually. Ron's house and lots of others. So some of you might not know where Chase's Tavern is, and you drive by it probably many times during the day. And it is on Emery's Lane, which is where Portsmouth Avenue, before the bypass was built, passed within feet of that front door, and it's approximately across from Sweet Dreams Bakery. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Marcia Blaine. Dr. Blaine is a professor of history at Plymouth State University. She's currently interim director of the Museum of the White Mountains at Plymouth, and she's been a popular lecturer for the New Hampshire Humanities and their Humanities to Go program, especially her program on on New Hampshire taverns. And tonight, she's going to build on that and bring it a little bit more local.
Hi everyone. When I was looking at the old provincial records, and if you don't know about the New Hampshire provincial and state papers, I urge you to look at them. They're probably in the library. They're 40 volumes. And so when I began doing some research on women and power, is what I was really interested in, and how they related to the executive part of the government of colonial New Hampshire, I kept running across these tavern keepers. They had to get a license from the government. So here's another woman. She was being paid by the government. What was going on with these people? And so I started gathering information about them, even though they weren't supposed to be part of what I was studying. And then I realized actually they fit right in. Because these women often were the center of power within a town, and the center often of power also over in Portsmouth. So we're going to be looking at taverns in Stratham, and Love Chase is our focus. Most of you know about this particular map. It's a fabulous map, actually one of my favorite post-colonial maps, but not quite, in the modern era. And this picture of this map of Stratham is from 1793, but I'm going to take you just a little closer so that we can also see that when we're looking kind of at the center of town, and I've got to get, so Major Dudley Love Chase right here. And the tavern that Rebecca was just talking about, right close together. The people who ran taverns knew that if you want to have a successful tavern, you've got to be in a busy location. So location is, of course, extremely important. So when we're looking at women, you don't usually think of women running a tavern. And so I'm going to be looking with you at Love Chase a little bit more closely to figure out what was going on. So in a tavern, there was entertainment. And some people immediately go to, that kind of entertainment? But no, that's not the kind of entertainment, of course, that they were allowed to have. By entertainment, they meant that people would come into the tavern and they would receive food and drink. And if they were strangers, they would receive a bed, a place to sleep. Doesn't necessarily have to be a bed, by the way. Some place to sleep. They also have a place for the animals. That's what they're talking about when they're talking about entertainment. There was also licensing. And of course, when you think of licensing, this is going to the government of the colonial and now the state government and asking for permission to run a tavern. You could not sell liquor by the glass or by the barrel if you did not have a tavern license. And so these people had to go and get a license. That was a choice. You could have decided that this was not what you were interested in, But if you went to them, you had to have that license. And if you got a license, you also had to have permission from your select board. So if the select board looked at you and said, "Are you kidding? You can't even keep your own family in line and you want to run a tavern? No way." I mean, they'd turn people away. But at the same time, they would also sometimes go to people and say, "Please, run a tavern. Where you are, we need a place for strangers in town. We also need a place where when people are paying, they can come and rest in your tavern." Often taverns were also right next to the, as you can see here, to the meeting house. So you go to church in the morning, you go to the tavern in the midday, and you go to church in the afternoon on Sundays. Often not to the minister's liking, because in the afternoon you might not be quite as attentive as you had been in the morning. But location, obviously, tremendously important. Also, they had to provide, if you think of women in tavern keeping, it was a place where women lived as well as worked. So if you had, as one woman did, 7 children under 7 and an unknown number of children above that, 7 children under 7, it just gives me the willies. But if you did, you would be able to stay home and care for your children. So you can imagine somebody walking into the tavern, here's Love Chase, one child on her hip, another attached to her skirts, as she greets the person who's coming in, as she's stirring whatever's on the fire, welcoming them, and then offering to serve them a drink. But it was also a public trust. Okay, think about the word a public house. It's licensed, it's open to the public, they have to accept anyone that comes, they have certain laws they have to follow, they are the place people go for news, they're a really important center. We don't think of women as running that kind of a central location, and yet they were some of the most trusted tavern keepers in New Hampshire. Also think of the word, Rebecca was talking about this, the number of different names there are for taverns. One of them is a public house. In England, that's shortened to pub. And that's where that word came from. I always think that's kind of interesting to think about. But it's a public trust. You had to have your neighbors agree, "Oh, you've been a tavern for a year. Yeah, you do pretty well." So the tavern keeper would be able to go back to the select board and say, "I need to renew my license." Now, as Rebecca pointed out, not every tavern license still exists. If you go to the New Hampshire archives, you can go looking through the court records, you can find the tavern licenses, but you can also see they're often on little odd sheets of paper that have gotten lost, some of them, over time. So knowing that somebody was a tavern earlier, but not finding a tavern license for several years, makes perfect sense. And then the thing that I think really is an oddity when you think of women in the colonial period, they had a voice of authority. Because if they could not keep control within their tavern, they would lose their license. It didn't happen very often. As a matter of fact, the only one I found between 1690 and 1770 was a woman in in Portsmouth, named Elizabeth Wybird. Wybird had inherited her mother's tavern, and when she began running the tavern, she was young, she was inexperienced, she was a recent widow too, so she apparently just came into the tavern, began running it, using the supply of liquor her mother had left behind, and one night a group of sailors got out of hand. The out-of-handness spilled out into the streets, and so she lost her license. In the morning, the governor and council said, you cannot keep a license anymore. In the afternoon, she went to the governor and council and asked to have her license back. She got it. The only tavern keeper I know, only female tavern keeper I know, who was unable to use her voice of authority to be able to keep control of what was happening within her tavern. So women were able to do these things. They were able to do that in part because they were very good business people. They recognized the importance of the location. And you know from where the Chase Tavern is or where the Kenniston Tavern is, they were on very important roads. These roads meant that they needed to have a place for strangers to stay, as well as the food and drink that they needed. So these women were very savvy about running their taverns. So what can happen in a tavern? Well, I've given you some examples from Love Chase's tavern. So from the treasury records,